How the Federal Reserve was planned after Lincoln's death. Lincoln resisted a central bank. 50 years later, they created one anyway. Part 1. The President, who printed his own money. In 1861, as America erupted into civil war, Abraham Lincoln faced a brutal truth. The Union needed funding, desperately. Private European banks, especially those connected to the Rothschild dynasty, offered loans, but at interest rates up to 36%. To accept such terms would plunge the country into permanent debt servitude. Lincoln refused. Instead, he chose a radical solution. He empowered the U.S. Treasury to issue its own currency, Greenbacks. These weren't backed by gold. They weren't issued by private banks. And, most threatening of all, they didn't carry interest. Lincoln believed the power to create money should belong to the people's government, not to a group of unelected bankers. In his own words, "The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity." The greenback was more than currency. It was a declaration of independence from the global banking system. Part 2. The Invisible Enemy. Lincoln's move was a direct threat to a centuries-old model. Private banks issuing debt-based money and charging governments interest to use it. This system had enriched powerful families across Europe, and they didn't take kindly to being bypassed. In 1865, the Civil War ended. And just 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated. John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. But many have asked, who was behind him? Booth had links to the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secretive pro-Confederate society with rumored connections to wealthy financiers in both the South and Europe. Some researchers believe Lincoln wasn't just eliminated for political reasons, but because he challenged the one thing more sacred than kings or borders: the money system. Part 3. The Quiet Erasure of Greenbacks. After Lincoln's death, the momentum behind greenbacks began to erode. Private bankers lobbied hard to destroy debt-free money. In 1874, Congress passed the Resumption Act, which began retiring greenbacks and returning to a gold-backed system, a system that relied on borrowing from private banks. The return to the gold standard wasn't about stability. It was about restoring control, shifting money creation back into the hands of the same banking elite Lincoln had defied. By the late 1800s, Wall Street, with backing from European financiers, had reclaimed its influence. Banks like J.P. Morgan & Co., Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and the House of Rothschild were financing railroads, industries, and political campaigns. Greenbacks had shown what was possible, and that's exactly why they had to go. Part 4. The Panic They Not Needed. In 1907, a financial crisis rocked the United States. The stock market collapsed, banks failed, panic spread. But the panic wasn't accidental. Behind the scenes, J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, orchestrated a private bailout, positioning himself as a savior while reinforcing the need for a centralized solution. It worked. The public, terrified of another crash, became open to the idea of a national banking authority. Not controlled by the people, but by bankers themselves. Part 5. Jekyll Island, the birthplace of the Fed. In 1910, a secret meeting took place at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Attending were representatives from J.P. Morgan Rockefeller Interests Kuhn, Loeb National City Bank Warburg Banking House, Germany, and Senator Nelson Aldrich. Tied to the Rockefeller family. Their goal? To draft a plan that would create a central bank, but disguise it as a government solution. The result was the Federal Reserve Act. Passed in 1913, the Federal Reserve would control America's money supply. It would issue the currency. It would lend to the government, with interest. And though it was branded as a government institution, it was, and remains, a private banking cartel, accountable to its shareholders, not the American public. Part 6. From greenbacks to Federal Reserve notes. Lincoln's greenbacks were issued debt-free by the U.S. Treasury. But today, your money, the dollar bills in your pocket, are Federal Reserve notes. That's not just a name, it's a legal difference. Every Federal Reserve note is a debt instrument. It exists only because someone somewhere owes money, with interest, to the banking system. The very power Lincoln tried to remove from private hands is now absolute. Part 7. Why it still matters today. Since 1913, the U.S. has gone from $0 in central bank debt to over $34 trillion in national debt. The dollar has lost over 96% of its value. Boom-bust cycles are more frequent, and the real power over interest rates, inflation, and liquidity lies not with Congress or the President, but with the Federal Reserve Board, an institution Lincoln would have never allowed. Part 8. What they don't teach in school. You're taught that Lincoln was the great emancipator, that he ended slavery and preserved the Union. But few mention that he also tried to free the nation from the tyranny of debt. He fought for monetary sovereignty, he printed public money, and he died shortly after doing so. 50 years later, his efforts were buried, and a new era began, the age of the Fed. The very institution he resisted now controls the money supply of the most powerful nation on earth. Final thought: Lincoln resisted a central bank. 50 years later, they created one anyway. Some say the pen is mightier than the sword. But in modern history, the printing press is deadlier than both. This isn't just history, this is a warning. Because if they erase the Greenbacks, they can erase anything and anyone who threatens the system. Like, share, and follow if you believe history deserves to be told in full, not filtered through the lens of power.